Hi everyone, I hope you're having a lovely summer. I'm reading a chapter from a book today that we'll be studying in year 6 when we start in the first term. It's a book called Survivors by David Long, and it's lots of different chapters based around true events of survivors. And the one that I'll be reading you is Julianne Kupka, The Girl Who Fell from the Sky, Peru, 1971. Now, I don't have the book, so I'm just going to be reading off some pages. I hope you enjoy. It's a really great chapter. On Christmas Eve, 17-year-old Julianne was flying high above the South American rainforest when the airliner carrying her and her mother was hit by a violent storm. The previous evening had been prom night at Julianne's school, but now term was over and they were heading home for the holidays. Home meant the remote Amazonian town of Pucallpa in Peru, where Julianne's father, Hans Wilhelm, worked as a biologist, and her mother, Maria, was an ornithologist who studied birds and their behaviours. Sharing her parents' passion for science and nature, Julianne planned to follow their examples by studying biology at university. On board the four-engined aeroplane, she could hear other passengers complaining about the flight that had been delayed for nearly 7 hours. But they were airborne now, and Julianne was happy to be on holiday and looking forward to seeing her father. From her window seat, she noticed storm clouds in the distance, but she loved flying and had no reason to feel afraid. Her mother felt less relaxed about the storm, never quite believing that something metal could be like the birds that rival the birds that she studied. Maria didn't like flying at the best of times. Now she began to feel anxious, and as the plane dipped suddenly and entered a massive rain cloud, before long the plane was being buffeted about by the air currents, and after a few minutes even Julianne began to feel like something wasn't quite right. Bags and other pieces of luggage started to fall overhead, and racks and drinks tipped into passengers' laps. Soon, Christmas presents and parcels began bouncing around the cabin as the aircraft was pitched up and down by the turbulence. Through the window, Julianne could see flashes of lightning around the aircraft. With the storm obviously closing in, she too began to feel quite scared. Above the sound of the propellers, several passengers could be heard crying as she reached across for her mother's hand. The violent pitching continued like this for nearly 10 minutes, throwing the aircraft this way and that. Gripping her mother's hand more tightly now, Julianne looked out of the window and saw that one of the engines was glowing brightly. Her mother also noticed this and very quietly said that this is the end. It's all over. They were the last words Julianne ever heard her say. Moments later, the cabin plunged into darkness and the aircraft went into a steep nosedive. Julianne couldn't see anything in the pitch black and couldn't hear anything but the roar of the engines. Then, just as suddenly, everything went silent. With a shock, the teenager realised she was somehow outside of the aeroplane, still strapped in her seat, but tumbling over and over and over. With nothing around her but the rush of cold air, she was plummeting down towards the jungle. Coming out of the clouds, she momentarily glimpsed at the tops of the trees spinning up to meet her like a patch of giant broccoli. It was petrifying, but she had passed out immediately because the next thing she remembered was waking up the following morning. It was Christmas Day. She was still strapped into her seat, but it was wedged firmly into the ground. 40 minutes after taking off, the aircraft had apparently been struck by lightning, one deadly bolt causing a fuel tank to explode and rip off the right wing. As the fuselage began to disintegrate around her, Julianne had been thrown clear of the airborne wreckage and then fell more than 2 miles down into the jungle. Wow. Despite the trauma of this experience, she realised at once what had happened. Looking up at the tree, she knew she had survived an air disaster, probably because her seat had broken the fall as she crashed through the dense foliage. Unsurprisingly, the 17-year-old was in considerable pain and feeling dizzy. She'd broken her collarbone, damaged a ligament in one of her knees, and sustained deep cuts and bruises as she hit the ground. Her left eye was also swollen shut, but she could still walk, and she knew she had to start finding her way to safety. Julianne had learned enough about the jungle from her parents to know it wasn't as dangerous as people like to think. Travelling on foot was important to keep a cool head and not to do anything foolish, but she had no idea where she was going or were there any other passengers had fallen down too. She had lost a shoe and her glasses, which complicated things a little as she was short-sighted. Nor was she dressed for a jungle trek with only a light cotton summer dress to protect her from the hordes of biting, stinging insects that were buzzing all around her. The first thing to establish was, is anyone else nearby, especially her mother. But when Julianne called out and there was no response except the clutter of startled animals, sometimes later she was thrilled to hear an aircraft circling overhead. Presumably the crew were looking for survivors, but since she couldn't see the plane through the thick canopies of the tree, quickly guessed they couldn't see her either. This realization made her feel utterly alone. For a while, the family had lived in a remote science research station, and Hans Wellnam had taught his daughter some useful survival tips. For example, told her to walk through shallow water could be safer than walking on the land. Snakes and other venomous creatures are hard to spot on the ground and may attack if anyone steps near them. Julianne also knew that jungle settlements tend to build along the rivers, so if she stayed near the water, she'd have a better chance of meeting someone and finding help. Until this happened, however, her situation looked desperate. She had nothing to eat except a small bag of sweets, and she had no idea how far she might have to walk to reach safety. Soon, dozens of insects were dropping onto her skin and climbing into her hair. And with the sun up in the rainforest was unbearably hot. It was also very wet from the torrential storms like the one they had brought down the plain and continued on and off throughout the day. Having failed to find signal of anyone nearby, Julianne started to walk, and when she came to a small stream, she decided to follow it. It was lucky that there was plenty of water to drink, but the rainy season meant there was no ripe fruit on the trees, and for her parents' jungle training, she knew that eating anything else would be too risky. At nightfall, temperatures dropped dramatically, and with her sleeveless dress wet through, Julianne felt terribly cold. She also felt very lonely and was very frightened. Unable to sleep, she sat shivering as she listened to the startled sounds of the rainforest at night. The following morning, she continued slowly along the course of the stream. It didn't take her long before the little bag of sweets was empty and her watch had stopped. She rapidly lost track of time. After a couple of days, she heard the sound of the king vultures somewhere nearby. From her mother, Julianne knew that these huge carnivores tend to land only where there's lots of food around. Knowing they'd eat only dead animals, she had to consider the gruesome possibility that the birds were looking for bodies from the plain. To her horror, her fears were proven correctly. Shortly after, when she stumbled upon a bank of seats from the aircraft, it was partly buried in the underground, and Julianne could see 3 bodies still strapped in place. For a moment, she thought one of them might have been her mother, but then she noticed nail varnish on the toes, which Maria never wore. In fact, Julianne never found any more survivors during her time in the jungle. She later learned that of the 91 people on board the plane, she was the only one left alive. For several days, she continued her journey downstream, alternating from walking and swimming. This made her progress very slow, and swimming led to serious burns from the sun beating down on her back and arms. Together with other injuries, this caused her more and more pain, while a lack of sleep and the effort needed to keep moving only added to her exhaustion. She was also alarmed to find that the insect bites were becoming infected and that live maggots were now burrowing under her skin. After a week, Julianne realised that she could no longer hear aircrafts above, meaning the authorities must have stopped looking for survivors. This scared her, also making her very angry, knowing they'd given up, even though she was in the jungle below, still fighting for her life. She began to despair, but on the 9th day, to her astonishment and delight, she found an old broken down boat on a stretch of riverbank where she'd been resting. Her first thought was to take the boat, but she didn't want to be accused of stealing. Instead, she looked around and noticed a path running up the bank into the trees. Climbing the path took all her strength, as she was so tired and hungry, but at the top she found a small shack. Inside it was an outboard motor and a can of fuel. which reminded her of a trick her father had used to cure the family dog of worms. Pouring petrol onto the wound ought to kill the maggots, or at least get them off her skin. Julianne knew that the stinging would be excruciating, but it had to be worth a try. After dousing one arm in the flammable liquid, she counted no fewer than 40 maggots as they dropped out of the wounds onto the ground. Ugh, doesn't sound good. The effort left her even more exhausted, and wrapping herself in tarpaulin from the shack, and she quickly fell asleep. Waking the following day, Kopek didn't feel much better and decided to stay in the shelter a bit longer because she was too tired to move. Outside, she could hear another rainforest beginning, but later, as the rain died away, she thought she could hear voices approaching the shack. Struggling to her feet and pulling open the door, she was overjoyed to see 3 forest workers. The men were astonished and she quickly explained about the crash and how she'd spent the last 10 days alone in the forest. The men offered her some food, but after so long without eating anything except for having water, she was unable to eat. They quickly decided to take her downriver in their canoe. After 7 hours on the water, she was flown to a hospital and reunited with her father and Pukulpa. Happily, Julianne went to make a full recovery, although for years after she was haunted by the nightmares about her ordeal and loss of her mother and the other passengers. Julianne never lost the love of biology. However, after qualifying in Germany, she returned to Peru many times to visit the rainforest and study the wildlife. What an interesting chapter. Can't wait to continue reading this when we start back in Year 6. Have a lovely rest of the summer. Speak to you soon. Bye.